Alright, Jakob Stief here, the long-haired freaky dude. Today I'm going to review Book 4 of the Histories of Herodotus, named after the muse of tragedy Melpomene and translated into English by George Rawlinson. Book 4 focuses a lot on the beginnings of the Persian conquest where Darius is king. It goes over his feeble attempt at trying to conquer the nomadic Scythians, and it covers a few Persian stories on the Egyptian and the Libyan front. Now this book takes on a more serious note, more serious than the previous three, I think. Herodotus breaks away from his typical off-topic style and changes to presenting a congruous narrative of the Persian expedition into Scythia. There are still, of course, marvelous and fantastical stories in here, but less so it seems than in the previous books. Before I begin talking about the stories of this book, I want to point out a few specific quotes which really explain why Herodotus' histories are the way they are. In these books, there's a lot of incredible, magical, but suspicious stories that go on. It's really easy for one to question the credibility of Herodotus. And Herodotus, he actually understands this. If this is true, I know not. I but write what is said. He's not necessarily trying with his histories to recount everything with historical accuracy. His goal is to recount the stories and the customs of the cultures as the cultures see them. He's very objective with these things. These other cultures will say things which sound absurd, and sound to him absurd. And he does point out the things which he thinks to be absurd or questionable, but he reports it nonetheless. For he does admit that he has no way of proving, but he also has no way of disproving what they say. So it could be credible. And that's why Herodotus says all of the crazy things that he does say. At one point, Herodotus complains about why something was named, but then settles the argument with himself as such. However, let us quit these matters. We shall ourselves continue to use the names which custom sanctioned. We can bicker all we want about how something got its name, but in the end, it's just easier to go with what has always been there. So the first part of this book talks about the Scythians, a civilized nomadic culture with customs deemed savage in modern context. They dwelled in a region around the Black Sea and pretty much all around the Caspian Sea. And boy, their culture had some customs that would make Hannibal Lecter blush. Now, Herodotus claims, "The country has no marvels except its rivers, which are large and more numerous than those of any other land." Of these rivers includes the Danube River. But by virtue of Herodotus' own narrative, I'm going to have to disagree and say that there are in fact many marvels with the Scythians. The most interesting, I think, is this. The Scythian soldier drinks the blood of the first man he overthrows in battle. I mean, that alone is eye-catching. But taking into consideration the location of the Scythians makes it all the more mysterious. Part of Scythia, especially the part pertaining to Herodotus' narrative, is the part to the west of the Euxine Sea, or the Black Sea. The region to the west of the Black Sea in modern times is Romania, Transylvania, Wallachia, where Dracula supposedly dwelled. So I am going to make an assertion, an educated guess, that the Scythians were, in fact, vampires. I simply don't see any other explanation for this. They live in Wallachia, they drink blood. I mean, what else would the Scythians be? Someone should write a book about this. And on the topic of human flesh, which is a very rousing point of discussion, have you ever had the pleasure of cleansing yourself with a Scythian napkin? Surely you have not known the finer points of debauchery until you have dabbed the creases of your lips with a Scythian napkin. In order to strip the skull of its covering, he makes a cut round the head above the ears, and, laying hold of the scalp, slips the skull out. Then with the rib of an ox he scrapes the scalp clean of flesh, and softening it by rubbing between his hands, uses it thenceforth as a napkin. What do you know? Extra absorbent. And these guys collected these things too to demonstrate battlefield achievements. You know, I wonder how human scalp feels as a toilet paper. And did the Scythians rub their aforementioned booty with it? And did you know that human leather is the whitest of all hides? Maybe that's why the Scythians also skin humans entirely. So they have one long hide which they then stretch and affix to a wooden frame which is mounted on a horse. I don't know about you, but I would be pretty dang freaked out if a man on a horse came roaring up with a human hide stretched out above it. Seeing the sky beyond the ballless eye holes is what would do it in for me. Or, I don't know, I might just ask him politely to wrap myself up in the hide like a coat. Who knows? Scythia's pretty cold, things can happen. And as far as Scythian commodities go, did you know that they have a self-boiling ox? That's right, self-boiling. Man, I bet Scythian infomercials had savages on the edge of their seats. It looked like Karate Kashyyyk right there. Whoa, psh, 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 psh. So what you do is you cut up the meat of the ox, then you put it into the hide of the box, which you fashion to the shape of a bowl, and then you heat it up over burning ox bones. So that by this plan, your ox is made to boil himself. How cool is that? I mean, come on. Why don't we come up with these things today? Ooh, and did I mention what the Scythians do when their king dies? Every man clips off a piece of his ear, crops his hair close, oh, that's horrifying, and makes a cut all around his arm, lacerates his forehead and his nose, and thrusts an arrow through his left hand. Straight up savage. There I am with the Karate Kashyyyk again. But I feel like this sort of thing would be bad for the logistics of battle. But hey, they were never conquered except possibly but doubtfully by the Egyptians. So they must have been doing something right, as whacked up as they are. The only way that they could have come up with such bizarre customs is if they were high. I mean, they must have been doing some pretty funky drugs. Oh, wait, what's this right here? Hemp grows in Scythia. The Scythians, as I said, take some of this hemp seed and, creeping under the felt coverings, throw it upon the red-hot stones. Immediately it smokes and gives out such a vapor as no Grecian vapor bath can exceed. Yep, they were stoned. Perhaps the only case in ancient history where it wasn't with rocks that they were stoned. Shh, Scythians. AKA the vampire gypsy masochist hippies. Yeah, they lived off the land, dude. That's partly why the Persians couldn't conquer them. The vampire gypsy masochist hippies had no homes, no farms, no buildings. As their king says at one point, the only thing they have which can possibly be destroyed is their burial tombs, which are almost impossible to find. So the Persians, led by Darius, came along to fight the vampire gypsy masochist hippies. And I would like to point out that somehow the Persians built a pontoon bridge, a floating bridge, over the Bosphorus between Byzantium and Chalcedon, and also over the Danube River. I think that is an utterly remarkable accomplishment for the time. I mean, you see similar types of bridges in World War II, like these floating bridges which engineers would make so that tanks could go across them. Anyways, these Persians had no idea what to do since there was nothing to capture or destroy, which was their usual means of doing things. There was no collateral to sway with the Scythians. The Scythians, being nomadic, decided to always remain a few days ahead of the Persian army. I mean, being nomads, they just kept on roaming. Always a few days ahead of the Persians. And here, what they did next, I think, is a brilliant, funny battle strategy. When the Persians first came, the Scythians tried to make alliances with neighboring cultures to attack the Persians, or to at least defend against the Persians. And there were some cultures who declined to align with them. And those who declined, the Scyths simply roamed right into their territory, leading the Persians after them. The Persians were led right into the territory of the people who refused to make alliance with the Scythians, and this allowed the two to duke it out. This both chipped away at the Persian army and dealt with a petulant neighbor. I mean, it's great. Let your enemies fight it out themselves. I mean, no need to get involved. But with this continuing strategy, the Scythians pulled the Persians almost all the way across the Black Sea, across the top border of the Black Sea. Now, the Persians had placed at the Ister/Danube River a force of Ionian troops, and they were given the order to burn the bridge if the Persians weren't back within 60 days. Knowing this, the Scythians tried to delay the Persians' return as much as possible. And when the Persians decided to retreat, the Scyths used back roads and made it to the Ister first. And they told the Ionians to leave. They said that they would as long as the Scyths assuredly destroyed the Persians. So the Scyths, they went on to attack the Persians head on. But by one of the saddest mishaps in warfare history, they accidentally took the same back roads they took there back as their attempt to hit the Persians. They took a road which they knew the Persians weren't taking to try to get to the Persians. I mean, I guess they didn't realize that the Persians didn't also take the back roads. I don't know. But the Scythians, they done messed up. They overshot the Persians make it to the Ister, Darius crosses over safely and lives happily ever after to reproduce and have children. But I suppose if he hadn't reproduced, then we wouldn't have the epic movie 300 to watch, now would we? And perhaps if this had happened, there might have not been any battle between democracy and monarchy. And there would have been no show of power over one or the other. One would not have had the chance to show that it can rise above the other. And the former, democracy, would have been lost to the corrosive hands of time. So maybe a battle between democracy and monarchy was in fact necessary for the survival of democracy. At least the survival of the memory of democracy. At one point during Darius's expedition, Herodotus makes many notes about the culture surrounding the Scyths. The first note was the Agathyrsi. The Agathyrsi are a race of men very luxurious and very fond of wearing gold on their persons. They have wives in common so that they may all be brothers, and, as members of one family, may neither envy or hate each other. I mean, that actually sounds like a nice, decent culture. Bling, love, no hate, no envy. What's not to like? The next is the Nurians. These guys were freaking lycanthropes. Ooh, jealous. Every Nurian once a year becomes a wolf for a few days, at the end of which time he is restored to his proper shape. So we've got the vampire gypsy masochist hippies, and then their neighbors are werewolves. I mean, how freaking cool is that? I see the beginning of a Len Wiseman movie here. Also of note are the androphagy. This immediately caught my eye because it is very similar to the word autophagy, which I am very familiar with. It essentially means self-cannibalism, eating one's own flesh. As it turns out, this was in the right ballpark. Their nation literally means people eaters. How exciting. So, cannibals, minus the self part. Finally, I think the most surprising thing, like this blew me off the toilet whenever I read it. He described to the far northwest a group of people who call themselves the Celts. Was Herodotus and the Greeks really aware of the Celts back in 400 BC? I don't know, I just think that's incredible. I mean, I didn't think they had any connection whatsoever with anyone really beyond the Black Sea. So the fact that they know of the Celts and they know their name, that blew my mind. And after all this jazz, we get to see a few broken family ties in a Greek city in Africa, aka Libya. And we also hear of a few cultures here. There's one where the people all paint themselves red and eat monkeys, whereof there is inexhaustible store in the hills. For some reason, I find that more disturbing than the cannibalistic cultures. What'd the monkey ever do to you? I just think of the poor monkey from Indiana Jones who ate the date. So sad. There is one town in here called Barca, which the Persians were going to attack. But rather than do a full frontal assault, they decided to dig tunnels and go under the city. But a soldier, catching on to their trickery, put his shield on the ground to detect the vibrations of the digging soldiers. And he could thus determine which way they were coming from, and which way they were mining. Now I'm pretty sure I've seen this on an episode of the Mythbusters before. Speaking of which, let's have a moment of silence for their passing. Okay, Mythbusters, you will never be forgotten. I loved you guys. Why'd you have to go away? Nonetheless, this sounds very familiar. I'm sure I've heard this story before. And apparently in Africa there are creatures without heads, whom Libyans declared to have their eyes in their breasts. I was unaware that Transcendentalists and Surrealists were around in BC Africa. And one important story of note, I think, is the story of the circumnavigation of Africa. There were legends about a man who went all the way around. The implications of this is that Africa was completely surrounded by water. So Xerxes, the later king of Persia, sent a man, Cetapses, something Persian, to see if this were true and that he could sail all the way around the world, or at least Africa. He did a good job too, the sailor. He went a long way, probably further than any explorer had done in that time. But he eventually came to a point where his ship would sail south no further. Now Xerxes, he didn't believe this. He thought that the sailor chickened out and turned around. So what does he do? He does what any good Persian would do. He kills the sailor. But to me, it sounds like he was probably telling the truth, the sailor. I mean, it sounds a lot like he made his way all the way down to the Horn of Africa, and he made it to the point where the Indian and the Atlantic Oceans meet. So my guess is that the currents of these mixing oceans is what was stopping him. So, Bartholomew Diaz, I'm going to have to say that before you there was another. Now, Herodotus, he doubted many of the claims of I'll just let you hear it for yourself. I cannot help but laugh when I see numbers of persons drawing maps of the world without having any reason to guide them, making as they do the ocean stream to run all the way around the earth, and the earth itself to be an exact circle, as if described by a pair of compasses. Silly Herodotus. But besides that, there weren't really many historical stories of the Scythians. Most of them were all current cultures or customs. And Herodotus also took a lot of this book's time to talk about the geography of the world. Or at least the world as he knew, or as others theorized it to be. And that was interesting. It was interesting seeing where their minds were at the time, what sort of theories they were toying around with, as well as what their logic and reasoning was. All that aside, there's just a few more quotes which I would like to discuss. The Scythians at one point said to Darius, "In return for calling thyself my lord, I say to thee, go weep." I love that. It's the ultimate insubordination to a monarch. And the vampire, gypsy, masochist hippies won against tyranny too. It's a good story. Now when the Persians retreated, they left behind their sick and wounded for the Scythians to deal with. The men who had been left behind, perceiving that they were betrayed by Darius, stretched out their hands toward the Scythians and spoke as befitted their situation. Yeah, these guys were just trying to kill you, is all. That's what becomes a man when he's brought to his lowest, most desperate point. When their might can no longer slay the foe, their tongue begins to pleasure the ear. Well, that is book 4 of the Histories of Herodotus. What's your take on the Scythians? What do you feel about their cultures and their customs? Feel free to discuss in the comments section below. Well, I'm Jakob Stief, the long-haired freaky dude. Thank you for watching. If you like this book review, please check out my channel and hit the subscribe button. There's many more great videos there, including literature, philosophy, math, that sort of thing, as well as headbanging, and now time-lapses of art. How cool is that? Well, I'm Jakob Stief, the long-haired freaky dude. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video, and have a good day.